I'm Dakota, Chief Marketing Officer, and this is Felicia, HR Manager, and we are joined by Megan, our General Counsel for HR Compliance. She's been joining us a lot more lately, making the trek up from South Carolina, where she's based. We're, of course, in Massachusetts. Megan likes to come up for the nice fall weather, though.
Oh, absolutely. It's still humid.
So we've
Humid and
got
horrible.
so we've got some compliance topics to cover with Megan, but also several interesting current events on the payroll and HR front. Now, our first one is not really, I wouldn't call it a current event, but there was an article that we found pretty interesting and something that you wouldn't expect to have to do at work, but apparently it happens more often than you might think. Panic attacks at work. How to support a colleague having a panic attack. I guess this happened, it's in the news because there was an Australian meteorologist who had one on air, and he turned to his colleague and said, you know what? I need to get out of the studio right now, so you're going to have to take it over. And she did very, very gracefully. So we wanted to talk a little bit about, like, what if one of your employees, one of your colleagues has a panic attack? What are you going to do in HR? What do you think, Meg?
You know, some of the articles that have mentioned that there is an increase in panic attacks, especially in a work environment. I think, the people are under a lot of strain and pressure at work and, pressure to perform. And obviously it's tied to your livelihood for most people that they need to work to support their families and to live and things. So I think that probably compounds some of the pressure that people feel. But I do think it's interesting because panic attacks, aside from some outward manifestations of symptoms, they're largely internal. So I think a lot of people kind of suffer silently with them. And, and as the coworkers, you're not, unless you're, incredibly observant or you have a personal relationship, you may not know that one of your colleagues is even experiencing one of these things. So I think there's a lot of, can be a lot of isolation, for people that experience panic attacks at work. And I think having a broader awareness about it, I think is great because it can be absolutely debilitating, and a lot of panic attacks are confused for cardiac events because you have such a sense of, of doom and ominous dread and anxiety and, rapid heart rate and sweating and difficulty breathing and faintness. It's just like these, these really significant physical manifestations of it that I think are greater awareness. And I give kudos to the Aussie meteorologist to be so forthcoming and to have alerted, it seems, to have alerted his colleagues in advance so they were aware that he was dealing with panic attacks, and they were, more than ready and willing, and like you said, gracefully to step in and to take over as needed. So I think that's great.
Yeah, it does say that they're often, they feel much worse than they look. Because he said he was even looking at the video of himself after the fact and said, I actually look very normal. I don't even look that nervous. So it's more the internal.
Yeah, and I think that also just goes to people and their mental health status in general, because, looped in that same category as panic attacks, you have people with anxiety, you have people with depression. And a lot of times you don't realize that the person next to you or the person that you talk to every day is struggling with this because they do look normal. They don't look like they're, this like anxious mess or, like they're not just constantly crying like you'd think someone who was depressed was. That's totally not the case at all, is they usually play it off very, very, very well.
So you two are obviously in the HR department here. You don't have to say specifically here, but have you had people come up to you and say, hey, or during meetings or during the onboarding process, just so you know, this is something?
I've never had somebody tell me during the onboarding process, but I have had times where people come into my office and they check in with me and they're like, hey, I'm feeling this way right now, and I just need to talk to someone, and I just need to check in with someone, and I just need to have a second to do that. And for me, I really love that I can be that type of person for them, that I'm able to be that kind of sounding board at times where they're able to come in and say, like, hey, I need my 5 minutes, and then they tell me what they're not necessarily panicking about, but worried about, thinking about, the thing that's on their mind, the thing that has them kind of worked up in some state or another. They're able to get it off their chest. I'm able to usually just listen, just kind of help them through it, ask them if there's something that I can do to help support them. Usually it's like, you just needed to listen. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then they're able to go back to their day and their normal functioning responsibilities and, generally have no issues. So I wouldn't say people tell me during the onboarding process, but it does usually come up at
Or
some
the interview
point.
process.
Yeah. It's not usually something people want to disclose in the interview process, which I could understand.
No, but it's crazy how it's tied to certain environments too. Because it's like, what's it called? Agoraphobia, right? What is that? Fear of big open spaces.
spaces.
Yeah. But or the opposite, like not open spaces.
Yeah, you have a
Like an airplane.
Right, exactly.
And this always makes me think of, I don't know if I've talked about my love of the Twilight Zone on this show before, but I love like the old Twilight Zone, like black and white. But you know the one. And then I was thinking when I was reading this article, I thought maybe he was having a panic attack. I'm talking about I don't know what's the guy's name? The actor who, I'm being really specific. When I tell you, you'll know. He's on the plane and he sees the like massive gorilla-like monster on the wing.
The remake
did talk
the
about
remake
this
with,
before.
with John Lithgow was like
It's
popularized.
not. It's the one before. Oh, it's.
version.
I just had his name on the tip of my tongue. William Shatner is in the
Oh,
original
is in
from
the
the
original.
50s, I think. And he sees the monster on the wing, like ripping the wires out of the wing, and now he is physically manifesting the panic attack in that. He's like sweating profusely, but nobody believes him. And every time he's like, "You have to look out this window and look at this monster on the wing." And they go to look, like the flight attendant looks, and the monster's obviously not there. But then, at the end, you're made to think, okay, he was imagining it the whole time. It was in his head, and he looks up from the stretcher when he's being like wheeled away, and the monster is like peering around the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, Lithgow did a remake in the
Yeah,
70s.
I like
think.
him.
But anyway, the parting advice from this article is the best thing to do if you see someone panicking is not to panic. Makes sense.
Yeah, because people read, you feed and read off other people's reactions, and it can either, exacerbate your experience, or it can help to, calm you down.
Yeah. I think that is also one of those things where, depending on the situation, you can't panic in response, especially if you have like a customer facing or client facing role. If you're suddenly in a store and you start panicking because someone else is panicking, then you're going to start having...
It's called mass hysteria.
Yes, exactly. Then you're going to have the customers in front of you panicking as well. Whereas I think it's a little bit different, here we are, for example, where we're not necessarily in the same building as our clients. So it's like, we're not going to suddenly take that panic and push it onto our clients because they're not physically here with us.
We're going to move on to quiet vacationing. Because we got all these you notice we have all these quiet
Lots of
trends,
quiet
quitting,
Quiet quitting.
quiet vacationing, quiet.
Quiet firing.
Is that?
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
one.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Yeah.
How do you quiet fire?
Well, the trend with it is quiet firing is basically like not giving people raises, kind of
I
just
see.
ignoring
Pushing 'em out.
them.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Quiet firing. And
Until
quiet
they
quitting is
eventually
when
quit.
they're ignoring you.
Yeah.
And quiet vacationing, they say, is emerging as a result of another trend, which this has been around for a couple of years. I think you see it with like, a bunch of startups and it's definitely a trendy thing, but unlimited PTO, which is funny because in my opinion, saying you have unlimited PTO is kind of like saying you have no PTO. Because it outlines in the article, like people think, oh, that sounds great on its surface, but it's like, well, what does that mean? Are you serious? Like, what am I supposed to do? Just take vacations all the time?
Right.
And so the thing that has been going on with unlimited PTO is they actually just don't take PTO at all, but they quiet vacation. So maybe they're like, I'm out today, or I'm remote for the next couple of days when they actually are going on vacation. So what do you think, Meg?
Yeah, I think it's...
First of all, have you taken a quiet vacation?
No, I took a vacation, but then had to do some work because some things cropped up. So I don't know, maybe that's the same thing.
I felt really bad about that.
That happens. No, but I think it's interesting. I think it's funny when you give, I think it's kind of like kids. And I certainly don't want to diminish or, compare, employees to children. But, children especially thrive on schedules and, parameters because these are our borders. And I think employees are the same way. And like in America, you see it globally, I think they had a stat of like 70% of people don't take their full, who have a confined amount of PTO annually. So I think employers were maybe trying to address that and say, basically take it as will. As long as you get your job done, there's not going to be any cap. But I think an unintended or maybe an unanticipated consequence of that is, like you said, Dakota, how do I go about that? Am I, do I request that, or do I say I'm going to be out or request this time? Like what's reasonable? And because there's not those guidelines for it, I think it makes people more hesitant to use it because a lot of it, I think, is off of, the rapport with your manager. It's like, well, do you feel comfortable asking your manager or telling your manager I'm going to be out for this period of time? Or like, I think the article mentions that the assumption for unlimited PTO is that there are at least 20 days per month of available paid time off, which is, 4 normal work weeks. So, and I think there was another article, and I don't know at the end of it, I think it was still ongoing, that they had an employee that was challenging to see if it would stand. And it's like, I'm going to challenge my employer's PTO. And they had been out for weeks at a time, and they were still on the payroll to see and actually test the theory of unlimited PTO. And I don't know what the end result was. I'm eager to see what exactly would happen. But I do think it makes people a little bit more gun shy because in the realm of, I know I have 2 weeks vacation. I'm going to, maybe I'll use it for April vacation for the kids. Maybe I'll use 1 week in July. It's more of like, I know I'm entitled to at least this amount. So I'm going to say I'm taking, I have 14 days, or I have 10 days, or however it's coined. I'm taking this time because I'm entitled to it. It's my allotment. I'm going to use it. Versus you have a question mark. It's like, well, what's the do I have to provide a justification for it now? Because I have kind of an open
Right.
quantity.
Yeah.
So
And
I think
for every employee who would maybe take advantage, there's probably 10 or more that are going to fall into the, it's kind of like self-regulation. Like, all right, I'm just going to use what is reasonable,
Right.
but I'm certainly not going to take unlimited. So they're probably banking on that. But the good thing is, unlimited PTO, what is it? It's a marketing thing too.
Yeah,
Like,
it-
oh, wow,
sure.
my company has unlimited
Yeah, it's a
PTO. Well, oh,
recruitment-
really? Well,
a
what does that mean? You're going to take a
recruitment
vacation every month?
Yeah.
No, but they
It's
have
just like
unlimited
a
PTO.
trendy-
Right.
Yeah.
And then the expectation is, well, I can't, and if I do take the time, am I going to be looked at differently than my other employees who choose not to take as much
Exactly.
PTO as I do?
Yeah.
And then you're in a constant comparison in terms of, well, how am I viewed
Yeah.
when I'm in versus out? So I think it was a nice idea. I like you said, I don't know how employers implement it in practice. I haven't seen any, specific guidelines of how unlimited PTO works, practically for our workforce. But I think, with quiet vacationing, where, in that circumstance, you're kind of there, but you're not. You're away, but you're working, somewhat. So you're still kind of on the radar in terms of getting your work done and things.
Well, it's like Jamie was on vacation and I called her on her cell phone and asked her how to set up the podcast equipment. Like that's so you probably
needed a lot
you
of
thought
help.
you were on a real vacation, but it turned into quiet.
I kind of knew.
You knew it was going to happen.
But that's just like your vacation, your past vacation, Megan.
Eh.
Or Felicia, what do you think about the compliance stuff with this?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. I think the compliance stuff with this is where it gets really, really tricky. Is it sounds cool, it sounds trendy. It's like, wow, look at that. But then from an HR standpoint, and Megan can attest to this too, when people leave their job, whether it's because of an involuntary thing or a voluntary thing, they could be owed that PTO that they accrued or that sick time that they accrued. And so if you have unlimited, what do you pay them? And, of course, different states have different accrual rates for sick time and things like that. So you can kind of look at that, but it's like, well, how much of that was used? How much wasn't? Like, there still has to be some metric for keeping track of it. And so from what I've seen, there's some guidance that suggests if you do this as a company, it's best to do it for the people who are like in executive roles, who are salaried, exempt individuals, and that this doesn't typically work out well for people who are an hourly employee. But Megan, what do you think about it?
I think you're right in terms of the, the state payout requirement because a number of states view accrued unused vacation, especially in some sick, depending on how your policy is coined as well, especially where a lot of states have paid sick leave, that they'll say that is payable, in certain respects. Some states will say it's not upon termination or discharge. But I think you have to err on, well, if you don't have an accrual mechanism because it is unlimited, it's basically, it's kind of ambiguous that you don't have an accrued PTO, therefore you don't have an accrued wage to pay out. So for those employees, I think you do have maybe it's less of it depending on if you use your PTO, but if you don't use any of that and then you are discharged or you decide to, go to another company that, any of that time that you could have used, I don't know how you could assign a monetary benefit that's payable upon discharge because it's a question mark, so that you're kind of leaving that on the table. If you don't exercise it and don't exercise the time, then also you don't have the ability to exercise the financial payout benefit either. So, which is kind of interesting. So.
Yeah. And even at that, I feel like there's so many employees, they just don't realize that they get paid out that time in general when they leave a job. That is always very surprising to me when I, am going through people's kind of like exit interviews and I explain to them, oh yeah, your last paycheck will pay you out all of your accrued PTO. And they're like, oh, I get that. Like, yes, you do. So an important thing to note for employees too, that you should get something paid out to you, likely depending on the state or industry that you're in at the end of employment.
Yeah, definitely check your state laws because they'll differentiate sometimes between sick versus vacation as an accrued wage, or if you have a combination plan like Checkwriters does, it's paid time off, so it covers sick, personal, vacation, any reason that you have for leave. That a lot of states will take those general PTO plans and kind of treat them the same as earned vacation, in which case that would be in most cases payable upon discharge or termination.
This next one is crazy. A Walmart employee is fired after being stabbed while trying to stop a shoplifter. The employee is totally fine, other than the fact that he got fired. He said the stab wound was no big deal. Actually, he went to work the next day after getting stabbed. He was like, yeah, it was just a little stab. Which, I mean, why would you fire that guy? He seems awesome. But it's kind of weird. Like, here's the guy, and then here's the CCTV footage of the interaction, which is like, we can't see what's happening at all. It's extremely blurry. But
And also, this is a 68-year-old man,
I know.
too. Like, this isn't
this
some,
guy's
like, young person chasing after, like...
well, he's certainly got the energy of a young person.
He does, but he's, it's not like this young person, like, chasing after these people. I mean, this is a 68-year-old man.
Yeah, and so, yeah, what happened was he noticed somebody in the store who apparently he noticed as a repeat shoplifter. He looked at this woman and said, yeah, she's been in here multiple times. She steals stuff all the time. And he finally said, I had just had enough of her stealing from Walmart. And he followed her out into the parking lot, tried to take the stuff out of the car that she had stolen. And then the guy that she was with stabbed him in the arm. And
Minor
then
flesh wound.
That's what he said. He said it was probably 3/4 of an inch wide, nothing big. And he went back to work the next day. But the ordeal was far from over because the following week he was fired because Walmart said that you are not allowed to follow employees or you're not allowed to follow shoplifters or patrons outside of the store, which I guess I can get that policy because they're probably trying to look out for the safety of the employee. But at the same time, then Walmart's like, oh, and by the way, if anybody can help us get the shoplifter, it's like, well, probably this guy is the best guy to get the shoplifter. So I called it Vigilante Employees. What do you think about Vigilante Employees, Megan?
Well, I think, and to Walmart's credit, that's probably, it's twofold, the policy that to have employees not follow suspected shoplifters out, one, for the safety of the employee, especially in this case. But to your point, Dakota, if you have a vigilante employee, perhaps they're wrong in their assessment of it, or perhaps
that's a good point,
where they're
yeah.
not trained, they're overly aggressive and they cause physical harm to a patron, in which you're looking at a lawsuit in that respect. So I can see Walmart's policy. I do think it's, the employees, opinion. I think a lot of employees have reached their threshold with shoplifting because it has become so pervasive, and they see through these policies, though they're well intentioned, that it is permitted, by these large corporations, and they are themselves. He's a 68-year-old guy who's working at Walmart, thinking, I work how many hours to pay for the things I probably purchase in my own store, and you have these people that are coming and shoplifting with impunity, and there's no repercussions. And I think the workforce is they've reached their threshold of tolerance for this type of behavior. And I think a lot of employees in those respects probably feel like, well, what is management or what is corporate doing to help us? And in one vein, they're making it more difficult for people to, like, if Felicia, if you ever go to buy formula at Walmart, it's locked up, and then you got to ring the bell, and then you're waiting and you're waiting and you're waiting, and like normal, hygiene, like deodorant and things are locked up. And so you're kind of penalizing customers because you're making it more, the shopping experience, a little more difficult. So I can certainly understand the employee sentiment that this, especially as a repeat
That's
offender.
the thing. I mean,
this girl was
imagine the
identified,
frustration. It's like you see
and,
the same person going in
Yeah.
week after week stealing
So-
stuff, and you can't even acknowledge it.
Exactly.
My mom used to work at a clothing store when my sisters were much younger. She worked at a clothing store at the mall, not to be named. And she witnessed that all the time because that was their policy too. And this is like a big like retail store. It's not like some little like shop thing. And she would witness people come in. They would take clothes off the shelves, and then they would go and say, "Oh, here, I'm returning this." And they would watch them do that. And then they could, because they didn't have a receipt, obviously, because they didn't buy it, they would have to issue them a store credit, and then they would go and they would buy whatever they wanted from the store.
Shameless.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's insane.
So, and I think you see some stores, I think maybe in Middler is like you see more loss prevention associates that are kind of towards the exits and kind of
right, I've heard of
monitoring
that, yeah.
things. But I don't know. I don't know if that's done.
See, I would
a
think that a store like
significant-
Walmart would have that type of employee.
But a store like Walmart is so huge.
Yeah,
Is
but they
it
could-
really worth it?
Well, I mean, if you have somebody who's stealing every week, maybe.
Well, maybe they don't think it's worth it.
Well, that's true too. But to your point, Megan, that it's not affecting. Management can say, "Oh, it's not really worth it," or executives saying, "Yeah, it's not really worth it. We're a mega billion-dollar company," but the individual employees are like, "Okay, well, now I'm basically standing here watching theft, and also I would expect that the thieves would become emboldened by a total lack of reaction from the staff
Yeah, I
each
think
time.
so.
And so eventually you're going to think, well, this is actually getting quite dangerous.
Oh yeah, and I think too, like even corporations that are invested in, and then they've probably reached their limit because they're trying to put in measures to mitigate shoplifting. Is that so much of the deterrent on the criminal side has been abrogated by state laws in recent years that diminishing the amount in which it's classified from misdemeanor to larceny to from felony in terms of the amount of goods stolen, or kind of doing a lot of diversion and kind of not having stiffer criminal penalties for shoplifters. And I think that you are seeing the effects that what normally would have had a greater deterrent effect from the criminal side in terms of repercussion, now that, as they say, the stick is kind of gone. So it's like, well, if we don't fear it on that side, what is the store going to do? Ban us?
Yeah.
They know that and these repeat shoplifters know that they have store policies where no one can follow them outside. No one is supposed to try and impede their exit or try to get the goods back, and they know it. And I think it's
Right.
it's a huge gap. So it'll be interesting to see.
One time. As a small child.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
I was gonna say in recent memory.
No. As a small child. And I remember
You've been waiting to get that off your chest for 20 years.
Whew, yeah. The store closed down. It must have been the thing that I saw. No, but it was, when I was a little kid, I was like 4 or 5. I put something in the stroller because I wanted it, even though my parents said no.
All kids do that.
Yeah. But I remember my mom telling me the police are going to come get you. You better hope that they never find out, all this stuff, right?
That is
The
great.
scare tactics. But it's insane because I remember when I was younger, that seemed more realistic, where now it's like,
The police aren't coming.
nobody is
Yeah,
coming.
yeah.
But nobody is coming to anybody first. Obviously,
Right.
nobody was going to get my little, it was a headband. It was a headband that I really, really
headband.
wanted. It had a bow on it. I got to keep it.
That's great.
Has that emboldened you for future?
I don't think so. It sounds
No,
like you were
because I was-
terrified of the police.
I was terrified I was going to get arrested. But if you don't have that fear installed in you, because nobody is making sure that nobody is saying anything to you when you're doing it, why wouldn't you keep doing it?
Right.
To these people. Even in this particular article, the man says she wasn't denying it. She just went about her day taking whatever she normally takes, and then
Yeah.
went to her car. She was completely unfazed
Yeah.
by it. Which
But it is. They had I don't know if it was TikTok or Instagram. I see the TikToks on Instagram that come up 2 weeks later because I don't have TikTok. So I see the replays. But they had one where they had a group of, looked like a family of young, maybe early teens and stuff. And they titled it "Eating for Free at Walmart." And they actually went around eating in the store, opening up, Lunchables, drinking.
These aren't free
things.
samples.
Oh my
And
gosh.
ate their way through the store and then they left. And it's like,
And it went viral on TikTok.
and they themselves posted them stealing from Walmart on TikTok. I don't know how many. Obviously, if it made its way to my algorithm, it's 2 weeks old, so it probably has a lot of views.
Which means
at
they
this
made money.
point.
Had to have been pretty popular.
That'd have been pretty popular if I get it 2 weeks later.
They made
you know?
money off of the video of them stealing stuff.
But yeah, but I think to your point is like
Wow.
it has emboldened people. Like even they're posting in the act of them stealing, of eating these things and not paying for it, which is wild.
Yeah, they need their
So-
mom to tell them to stop stealing stuff because the police are going to arrest them.
Well, I think the problem was the
I think the
parents.
mom
The
is in
parents
on
were
it.
engaging in with the kids.
All right. So the next item we have here, why employee happiness is starting to hinge more on HR fostered engagement rather than hybrid flexibility. So this kind of goes back to one of our favorite perennial topics here at Checkwriters, which is remote work and what's going on with remote workers. There's always something. And this is basically saying that remote work is fading a little bit in terms of of its attractiveness and novelty, which is understandable. And rather we're seeing a return to some of the traditional expectations from the HR department, like employee recognition, fostering a sense of belonging at the company, and prioritizing employee engagement. All things which are I think, I mean, you would agree, Felicia, for sure, more difficult in a remote environment. So it's kind of incumbent on HR folks to change a little bit and make these things happen for their remote employees also. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think just to start off with, it is so much easier to build a culture of employees and a good workplace culture when people are in the office together. It's hard to do it when you're remote, because when you're remote, it's like, oh, we got to connect with this person. And maybe depending on your workforce, you might have different people in different time zones, right? So it's hard to even just connect on that level. Also, I think so many of the things that happen in terms of people communicating with each other happen, like, as you're walking into a meeting or walking out, or not that you should do this, but those like little sidebar conversations during the meeting, and you can't do those when you're working remotely, because when you're working remotely and you're all on little squares, you can't say something to somebody right before the meeting or right after the meeting. So I think just that connectedness of teams, you completely miss out on it when you're completely remote. What we're doing this week, since Dakota mentioned payroll week, we bring all of our employees in, or at least encourage all of them to come in for the week. And our marketing team, Jamie, set up most of our events and things throughout the week. So we have a full agenda of games that we play, team build, which is essentially team building activities, different like food and lunch things. And you can't do that when you're remote. And I know, Megan, that's something that you say is being remote, like you miss out on these fun little things. And
That's why we've made her a regular podcast, because
That's
she has
why
to come in office a lot more.
we make her come up from South Carolina. But yeah, I think it really should be up to HR and marketing in some sense to kind of build that culture and that community. And it's so hard to do it when you're remote. It's not impossible. I think there's definitely things that you can do. And I think there's so many things that we've done with our remote employees to kind of make sure that they're still looped in to some aspect, but it's not the same. I don't think it will ever be the same.
Well, it's funny because the fact that they talk about, let's do things in person. Let's try to have these after hours meetups, which are sometimes more difficult to do than, during hours meetups. But it's almost an implicit acknowledgement that, yes, we do need these live interactions. We do need to make sure that people at the company see each other face-to-face, interact face-to-face, talk face-to-face at least once a quarter. That's kind of the goal of a lot of companies, especially ones who are fully remote. But Megan, what do you think? But you do, we see you a lot.
Yeah.
But what about people who, there are people that we see once a year.
Right. Yeah. And I think that it is difficult. Like to your point, Felicia, I think you take out the spontaneity requirement of a workplace when everything has to be scheduled, or you're trying to contact someone that's in a different time zone or in a different state. And a lot of times in terms of like the creative process, which was like some of like the larger companies where they had, these activities and kind of these amenities for employees, is that so much of the creative process was doing something unrelated to their daily task. It was playing pickleball, or it was going to lunch, or it was going to the arcade, or whatever it was doing, or joining a walking club, during the day for exercise. It was these type of unrelated activities with your coworkers, which sparked some great creative discussions about projects they were working with, and they were outside the traditional environment. And I think that absolutely can be helpful. And I think too, in developing a true, authentic rapport and collegiality with your coworkers, like they talk about it, with keyboard warriors and with anonymity on the internet, it's less so in a workplace because everyone knows your name, they have your square. But I think you treat people differently when you're constantly just responding to emails or chats, and it's a sanitized version of a person. So I do think that, when you're in person, you may have a coworker maybe with a differing viewpoint in terms of how to do something or a strategy or whatever it was. But I do think that there's a greater respect because they are in front of you and you can see them as a human and as a person. Whereas if your interactions are all metered through a keyboard or through a chat or through an online video, I think it kind of takes some of the humanity out of it, and it's more just like an entity that you're talking to rather than a person. So I do think you got to have some in person, and there is a trade-off. Hybrid work can give you a little more flexibility in your schedule, especially if you have other life obligations that come into play, but you don't get that kind of camaraderie that used to exist before COVID, where everybody was kind of in the and you had the little chit chats, and you say, oh, how are the kids, or what did you do this weekend, or how's your mom doing, it's like, how's those types of things build a true rapport. And now it's like, well, I don't know what they're doing. Like, they're green on Teams. Does that mean they're available? Are they at their desk? Are they getting ready to go on a call? Are they getting ready to go on a meeting? Are they drafting something?
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
true.
And it's like, oh, can I call you now? And then it's like, well, you can't call me now, but try 15 minutes. Then you're busy. Then it's like, versus you could just walk by their cube and say, oh, just 2 seconds. Can I just grab you for this? Or can you meet me for a cup of coffee downstairs? I want to talk to you about this. So I do think that's something that you can't replicate in a remote environment.
Yeah. But there's trade-offs for everything because like you said, well, I mean, we just had an employee here who I said, oh, I haven't seen you in a while. And she came in for payroll week. She said, oh yeah, but it's really great that I've been able to work because, I'm taking care of my mom the past 6 months or so. But it's things like that. So, I mean, that is great that we can provide that companies can provide that sort of flexibility to employees who need it. But yeah, of course, like anything, there's trade-offs, there's pros and cons with it. What do you think, Felicia, some things that people who have built a fully remote workforce over the past couple years with everything changing, but now they're starting to see, we are losing out on these connections. What are some reasonable things that companies can do, especially if they don't have the budget to like fly in employees from all over the country? Maybe they don't even have a headquarters, or they don't have the budget to say, hey, let's all meet in, I don't know, Hawaii.
in a mutual place. Yeah. I mean, I think the important thing is just to stay connected to them in some way. So I think being able to get on a video chat is where you actually have your video on.
Well, I've heard you say to people, because our offices are next to each other, I've heard you say, oh, I don't see you. Turn on your video.
Yep.
And I actually heard somebody say, oh, I don't know if it works. And you said, it works. Which, I mean, you kind of just, you do have to give that encouragement and say it.
Yeah, no, that is the teacher in me from Zoom school. But no, I really do think that is so important, because even if you're talking on a Teams or a Zoom call and the person is, you just see their picture or, their initials or something, that is not the same as looking at their face. So if you can't be together in real life, you have to do it as close to the real thing as possible. Megan and I have a meeting every single week where we talk. We have our real faces on the camera. Sometimes we're at home and things are crazy behind us. And sometimes, well, most of the time I am in the office, so it's not as crazy behind me. But even at that, there's times where we'll be on the call and people will pop into my office and I'm like, oh yeah, like we're talking to Megan. And then it's like, oh, like Megan says hi to that person. Oops. Yeah. So, or it's like I'm greeting her children and things like that. So I think just building.
They're not usually there. Just like,
tank top.
Well, I see them once in a while too.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
I don't want that.
But also, Megan's husband and I have a tank top Friday. So,
Yes.
So even that, like, we've built that connection through.
Wait, I'm sorry. What is that?
Oh no, okay, that
Tank top Friday.
Tank top Friday.
It's not Friday,
It's not
so
really
today's
a
not
thing.
tank top
Yeah.
Friday.
What, you guys
It
just wear tank tops?
No, just by happenstance.
Yeah.
Because my husband is hybrid in a sense too. He has a number of different jobs that he works. So, but on Fridays during our meetings, he may have popped in the background and Charleston, obviously, it's incredibly hot.
I get
a
it.
lot of
I
time.
thought you said
Yeah.
that
He would
like
have a tank
it's
top
something
on,
that you
so
both
then-
wear tank tops.
No,
when you
so then
talk.
it
Well,
became kind of like as a
tank
running,
top.
Oh, it is
as a
that- it
running
is that.
joke,
Okay.
Tank Top Fridays, because
That's
he would
funny.
be in a tank top and he'd
Yes.
pop in
So
and out.
see,
So-
it's possible. I mean,
Exactly.
now that you're talking, it's actually you're getting some more interesting connection than you would if she wasn't remote.
Do you want
That's
to?
true. You get a peek into people, but I think
Yeah.
you're right. Is that you have to have, an attempt at personal contact, and I think it was great that we started a friendship in person. So it was much
Right.
easier to maintain, in a virtual environment. But they had a great game that I forget what it was, but it was like a game show that you could load up on your TV and you could play remotely with like another couple on Zoom. Like we did it and when we lived on the Cape with one of B's friends. And it was like you had on your computer, you had your thing, and they had like different trivia things or different things that you could do, and you could pay in real time with the other person. And their faces
that
would be
sounds
there.
fun.
Can
And
we
it
do
was-
that here?
It was
love
awesome. I'm
trivia.
like, it was like trivia, or it was like doing like different like charades and stuff, but it was in real time, and you have your own little cursor at the same time. So like, and I could see them in their living room with like their
Oh, I
snacks
see,
and their
yeah.
drinks, and like we were in ours, before we
that's so
before we
cool.
had kids. But it was
That's
like, I
awesome.
would do that. It was awesome. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to ask him what it
Well,
was.
so speaking of that, though, so tomorrow at our all hands meeting, we have where different managers are presenting on different topics. And so my topic that I'm not actually presenting on, but presenting on is team building. And so that's actually what my activity is just having people write down questions and then go around and talk to each other and just ask people the questions. Like, simple as that, because
Yeah.
so many people, they're not here on a regular basis. They
Hopefully
don't
that
know.
doesn't quickly devolve into that episode of The Office.
Oh my gosh!
Is that what you were thinking too?
I love it. It could never be done. Could never be done now.
No.
But it was. Oh my Lord! You can't replicate.
It's a classic.
Don't
Everyone
worry.
loves it, even if
I
It's a
have
classic.
parameters for my questions. I have thought through this. But no, I mean, I think back to your point though, Dakota, just in terms of building those connections and building a good foundation for communication with your remote workers is so, so important. Having those meetings in real life and even meeting with them. So many remote workers say, oh, I don't feel like my manager has any idea what I'm doing, because they don't. They're not there. And having those meetings with your manager to be able to talk about, this is what I'm working on right now, this is where most of my day is being spent, is so important, because your managers, they're not watching you, they're not seeing you. I mean, arguably, even if you're in an office, your manager's probably not going to be poking at your desk every few hours to be like, hey, so what are you doing now? But I think that's all just really important to keep that communication and keep it as authentic as possible.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too. Like, I mean, there are things that you would say via text that somebody may think, oh, or via Teams or email or whatever. And it's like, oh, are they annoyed about that?
Right.
And you're not. You're just like sending it like you are annoyed, or in all caps,
Or like if people don't say like LOL after, then it's like,
Yeah.
oh, are they mad?
Or
yeah,
the use
right.
of exclamation points. And
I
it's
use
like,
exclamation points, and you're the same, Megan.
I'm the
We use
same.
exclamation points
I'm
so
the same.
much.
It's just, I feel like it's just, and that's kind of like, well, how do you, put an inflection on a text? It's like, is it the, the monotone thank you, or is it like, oh, thanks, like thanks for your help, or is it like, thank you, you should have done this 2 weeks ago, like, it's like, what is the meaning behind it, which I think, and even if you don't mean it, you don't intend it to be something
Right.
that's intimidating or critical of anything. Sometimes, especially if you're by yourself, you can infer, oh, I think they're mad at me, or maybe I'm not doing a good job. And like that's where regular meetings with your managers and with your coworkers can help, because it can give you a barometer of like, I know I'm doing a good job. Take it and take it in the best way. I think it was St. Paul in terms of you want to infer the good. Always infer the good first before assuming a malintention. And that's where I
That's
think
a good policy.
you
Very
lose-
difficult to do.
You lose that a lot, with people that you automatically think. You don't automatically think the worst, but you think that there's some type of, kind of subversive or some kind of, edge when people ask for something or give feedback or something. And it's like, well, no, assume it comes from a good place and that they respect you, they want to collaborate you, they want to do a good job on whatever they're doing, and don't automatically assume that, oh, they think I'm an idiot, or my work product stinks, or I'm going to get fired, or they're going to report me. It's like, and I think some of that is missing maybe purposely or inadvertently, where there's so much virtual communication because there's a lot in between the lines that people fill in where you don't have, a clear, communication style, which can be difficult.
Right. And that can speak to employees' mental health as well. Like, from a mental health standpoint, working remotely, working hybrid, working in person, those can all have very different effects on a person depending on kind of how they function and how they feel about certain things. If you are extremely anxious as a person and you're communicating with people virtually all the time, that's probably not going to be very good for you.
Yeah.
So, lots of different things to consider.
We talked about this topic a couple of shows ago. The option for, in the new Secure 2.0 Act, the option for student loan repayments rather than, or to somebody to redirect money otherwise used for 401k to student loan repayments, right, Megan? And the reason we want to bring it up again is because there has been very recent IRS guidance on this, which kind of illuminates for employers a little bit what exactly, what are their parameters? Because employers were apparently waiting to potentially implement this before they got a clearer picture from the IRS about what exactly it meant and what it would look like in action. So Megan, can we talk a little bit about that?
Right. So the IRS, they issued some interim guidance, and in the end of the notice, after like a 2024-63, they actually have a request for comment. And they express an intention that Treasury and the IRS are going to issue and promulgate formalized regulations in terms of more the procedural requirements for QSLPs, qualified student loan payments. But they provide some interim guidance, to guide employers in terms of the theory of that you have an employer match to the amount that an employee is paying for a qualified student loan payment, so that on the same way that you would match an elective deferral. And a lot of the requirements trace the same things for elective deferrals as they do for the QSLPs. And it was a mechanism which, I think is a good compromise, that especially for a younger generation of employees, that they're either, not contributing as much or not contributing at all to employer-provided retirement plans because they're saving those funds to pay for their student loans. And, student loans have been a hot topic in the news, especially in the last several weeks, where you have a lot of the SAVE plan and different things from the Biden administration have been put on pause. So I think it was a good compromise to try and, recognize that there's a large demographic of employees that have a heavy lift with student loans, but there should also be the ability and kind of the obligation that they should provide for retirement and have some retirement savings. So I think it's a good compromise. In terms of the guidance from the notice, it sets forth, the type of plans that are eligible for a match. So employers are going to have to amend their plans in order to incorporate a
Would that be a
QSLP
lot of
match.
work?
Typically it wouldn't be. In terms of the interim guidance has been provided. In terms of how that kind of functions is going to remains to be seen, but that's something that we with their plan that employers can talk about with their plan. I assume there would be a cost for the amendment for the plan in some way, whether it be paying to someone to do it or having their own employee administrator do it. And the types of plans that are eligible are going to be your 401k, 403b, your simple IRA, or your government 457b plans are eligible to have that QSLP match incorporated with an amendment. And the important thing about the guidance is it gives some more definitional information in terms of what constitutes a QSLP, and that's going to be those are payments that are made, and there's a set definition, made by an employee during a plan year in repayment of a loan incurred by the employee to pay for the higher education expenses of the employee's spouse, or the employee's dependent. So it's not just limited to the employee's own education. It can be for a spouse or dependent. But there is a key qualifier that it has to be the obligation to pay that loan. So if you look into what typically happens, especially if you have a private loan, what happens a lot is you'd have a parent cosigner, for the loan, because the student probably had no credit history or the amount of the loan, that you'd have to have a cosigner and to assure that there would be repayment. So you have, for those employees that have a cosigner, the cosigner is joint and severally liable for the obligation to pay the loan at the same time as the borrower is. So they have a legal obligation to repay that loan, as opposed to, say, a guarantor, which sometimes you'd see guarantors, years ago, more in the context of especially purchasing a car for a teenager. You'd have a guarantor that only in the event that the borrower goes into default or does not pay the loan, does the guarantor's legal obligation to pay become activated. So in that case, if you're a guarantor, it wouldn't qualify as a QSLP under the interim guidance. And it goes through and talks about how QSLPs that employers cannot limit, the match to certain types of employees in terms of the type of loan that it is, the school that they went to, the degree that they obtained. So it's not like the same thing in terms of an employer reimbursement by an employer to say that, well, your job is an engineer. So, and if you wanted to have, loan, payments for education for courses towards, maybe a master's in engineering, that it has to be related to your job classification. That's not it with this. So QSLPs, like the employer cannot limit the type of loan or the type of program or the type of degree that the employee has received. It's an optional provision, so employers don't have to implement it if they don't want to. If they choose to do so, it has to be made available to anyone that is basically under the same eligibility requirements to do an elective deferral. So if an employee that could contribute to the plan by doing an elective deferral, then the employer has to make it available to all those employees that are eligible. They can't limit it to just certain classes of employees. The other thing is that it goes through broadly in terms of the certification process. So in order for employees to get the benefit of the match, they have to certify that their loans actually, it is for a qualified education expenses. Like the loan is basically in repayment during the plan year and they're paying it. So they have to certify that, I have this loan with Sally Mae and I've paid this much per month and this is for the plan year applicable and I've actually made those payments and I have a legal obligation to make those payments. And the certification is that there's certain pieces of information in the certification that employees have to provide, and plans can require that they signify the amount of the loan, the date the payment was made, confirmation that the payment was actually made by the employee, confirmation that the loan being repaid is a QSLP for the qualified higher ed expenses for the employee, their spouse, or dependent, and confirmation that the loan was incurred by the employee so that there is a legal obligation for the employee to pay it. And the guidance discusses that employers are, able to rely on the employee's representations or certifications that these loans are in repayment, they're making these payments, and they can require independent verification if they so choose, but it has to be in accordance with reasonable procedures. And one of the mechanisms that they've described is that they permitting employees to basically do a payroll deduction for student loans. So like obviously if you have a payroll deduction for your student loan and it's being sent to a third-party agency to your loan servicer, the employer knows, in fact, because they're diverting the payment to your employer, similar to child support, just like if you would have for child support, that payment has been made because it's through payroll deduction. So that was one of the proposed examples in terms of verification. You're going to have annual contribution limits in the same amount of the elective deferrals for the year. So like we discussed last time when they first came out, is that you can have up to the contribution limit either of all QSLPs, or you can have a combination of QSLPs and elective deferrals so long as you don't reach the limit of both. The elective deferral limit is going to apply whether you do one type or both types, or, there's going to be the claim deadlines you can input in terms of, when an employee has to submit a claim for the match. And one of the suggested examples was in 3 months of the end of the plan year to say, well, I want to have these matched for the plan year for the claim deadline. They also made a note in terms of contribution frequency so that the matches can be contributed at a different frequency than the elective deferral matches. So if you have an employer, if the arrangement is typically that the elective deferral and the match is made on a payroll cadence in terms of whatever the payroll frequency is, you don't have to apply that same frequency to QSLPs. So you could have it, but maybe even on a quarterly basis, but it has to be at least annually that match has to be done. But it doesn't have to be on the same cadence as you would have elective deferrals. And importantly, the guidance in the notice applies for plan years beginning after December 31, 2024, so January of 2025, in which case employers that have tried to, as Dakota mentioned, in 2023, after 2023 when it became available, have tried to implement Secure 2.0, the provisions existing at that time without this guidance, they'll basically be given, like, if you have a good faith reliance and have done so, then, your attempt to do so will be taken as a good faith effort and a reasonable interpretation, where this is not going to apply until the beginning of next year.
Always nice when they take good faith efforts.
Yeah, so employees that have tried to implement it, and have done on a good faith basis, then they're going to be given, credit for that.
Well, thanks for that overview, Megan. That is called Megan's attorney, no details left out overview.
Yes, apologies if that's, but I wanted to hit I had made some notes.
But you know what? That's one good thing. If you listen to this, when we have Megan on, you are not going to be missing a thing.
Whether right or wrong.
Yeah, no, it's right. But the other good thing is if you go to the Checkwriters LinkedIn page, Megan routinely posts compliance updates on there that are kind of abbreviated versions. And then, of course, she links to the original. So, and we have one on there right now about this very topic that she wrote up, and we'll have more information about that on our News and Compliance Center. But, when you're talking about this, Megan, I think people have a lot of opinions on student loans. Like, they're exorbitant. They, you like or not what the majors were or this or that or whatever the payment mandates are. But the way I look at it, if I'm an employer, it's a reality that you have a massive contingent of people for whom this is a reality. And I think you're crazy not to take a look at this, especially since it's no skin off the employer's back.
Right. The only cost, and as opposed to the EAP programs, the education assistance programs, where the employer is actually paying up to a threshold towards the employee's student loans. The only costs are going to be administrative costs in terms of tracking the payments, that the payments have been made, and in terms of the record keeping requirements.
But when we say that, that's something
guidance
that they would be doing anyway as part of their offerings of the 401k, right?
Yes and no, because the elective deferrals are going to be a part of your salary deferral on your paycheck. So it's just going to be administrative in terms of whether you're electing to have, like a 3% match or a 5% match or whatever it is. The employer is going to be obligated, like the employee has to certify certain information about the loan. They have to certify that it was paid, that they have a legal obligation to pay it, that it meets the higher education expenses definition. So the employer is going to have to track and make sure that the employee, even if it's just the employee's representation in the certification document to say, I paid my loans for this month or paid my loans for the year or whatever it is, there's going to be some administrative procedures. But in terms of like an out-of-pocket expense, it won't, because it's a match. So the employer is going to match that anyway as if they were having the salary deferral versus the qualified student loans. An increased expense employers may see would be that it makes it more financially attainable for more employees of a demographic to participate than they would have before, because some employers are like, well, I can't contribute anything, and it's a match. So if I don't contribute, my employer doesn't contribute, right? So if they say, well, I can't afford to have a salary deferral because I have a $1,000 student loan payment to make, so I'm not going to contribute to retirement at this point, anyway.
I know
that you may have more employees taking advantage and participating, so long as they meet eligibility requirements for the plan. They may say, oh, well, I can do this because it's not coming out of my paycheck to participate. I can still make my student loan payments, and I'm getting the employer match, so at least there's some funding of my retirement at this point. Even if it's not as aggressive as I would have liked it to be, I can do both.
Exactly.
Now, the downside for the employee is, are they saying, well, our employee is going to take advantage of this and then basically skirt their obligations or kind of limit their retirement savings because they're going to say, well, I'm going to continue to pay my loans, and then
the fact of the matter is, like you said, sometimes it's just like if people have student loans, they can't do the retirement at that time. They need to do the student loans.
They need every cent.
If the employer offers this, it's definitely a retention, and it's definitely some goodwill, showing some goodwill and showing. We talk about employee engagement, and I would imagine this is certainly falls into that category.
I think so.
And I just think it's funny though. You think the typical employer or business owner is usually going to be quite a bit older than some of their workforce who are going to have student loans and maybe never had student loans, or when they went to school, it was such lower tuition costs than they are now.
Right.
And so I think they look at it as, well, why should I pay for somebody's student loans? Well, you're not paying for the student loans.
No.
You're giving them the vehicle by which they would otherwise be putting the money in your 401k. Yeah.
Like you said, obviously the damage is done, but it has been done. The
right,
loans
exactly.
have already been incurred. There's an obligation to repay.
So you might as well reach this demographic.
You might as well
offering a benefit that really speaks to what's going on with them at this time. Mm-hmm. So I think our last compliance topic is pay transparency, right, Megan? Because there's some updates on that.
Oh, sure. Yep. So at the end of July, Governor Healy of Massachusetts, as a lot of states have come in the past couple of years, signed a pay transparency law into effect. It will go into effect 1 year after signing. So July of 2025, it'll go into effect. And it's an act relative to salary range transparency. And it requires covered employers in Massachusetts to disclose salary ranges for job posting. Those are going to be both internal as well as those that use third-party posters. So if you use Monster. I don't know if anybody uses Monster anymore. Monster, but
Indeed is the one.
You know, or
Is Monster still?
I don't know if Monster.
It is.
I don't
It
know
is a
why.
thing.
I don't know
You
if they
can-
got bought. I don't know.
So we have a recruiting platform, and on our recruiting platform, there's dozens of
Job posting sites.
Yes, job posting sites, and Monster is still there. I think the
Oh,
biggest
wow.
ones right now are Indeed.
Indeed is definitely
LinkedIn is
LinkedIn.
huge, and ZipRecruiter.
ZipRecruiter. I always think of Micro. Love Micro. Yeah, it was ZipRecruiter. But yeah, so employers, there's going to be a 25 employee threshold in Massachusetts. They have to include pay ranges in all job postings, internal and external. Provide pay range information to employees who are offered promotions or transfers where there's a change of duties. And disclose pay ranges to current employees or applicants upon request. So the existing employees that, for their position, they can ask for a pay range. And pay range is defined as the salary or hourly wage range the employer reasonably expects to pay for the position. And that's, kind of the chief piece of the legislation. It's been interesting because salary, pay range disclosures are not new, and they've been kind of making their way across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And you see some larger companies have tried to get around it by extraordinarily large pay ranges, and you see a lot of companies. and they
0 to $1 million.
they said, but in effect, they had a number of positions for a large company in California, and the pay ranges for various positions ranged from 90,000 to 900,000 for the pay range. And
Sounds like I was pretty close.
And so, but it was funny because they're saying, well, this is basically a kind of a workaround.
That's ridiculous.
But then applicants are saying, well, if you're giving me the range, I'm applying at the top end. So it's like you have people now that are, so I don't know. And obviously
That's
companies have the
funny.
ability to entertain it. So it's interesting to see some companies try and, I know, be a little bit cheeky and kind of skate around it by having such large ranges, but it should be a reasonable range, especially when you're talking about existing employees or job transfers for employees, that employers have to take a good faith effort to determine what would I reasonably and actually pay this individual. And that's something that has to be taken into consideration. Another part of the legislation is going to be a pay data reporting requirement, and that's going to be applicable similar to the EEOC, to the EO1 report for employers in Massachusetts with 100 or more employees at any time during the prior calendar year who are subject to federal filing requirements. They are required to submit to the state secretary a copy of its EO1 data report for the prior year. They're not necessarily, it has to be EO pay data report, including, demographic information such as sex and gender and code and everything. And the EO1 meets that requirement, and companies that, it won't be any additional burden for companies that are already obligated to comply with the EO1 reporting requirements. They'll just have to give a copy to the Mass Secretary of State. And that deadline, the submission for that report is going to be in advance of January. It's going to be on February 1, 2025, that the workforce demographic and pay data reports will be due with Massachusetts employers with 100 or more employees. So that's on the horizon.
We're talking about this one in Massachusetts, which is relatively new, hasn't yet taken effect, but will be a few months from now.
Yep.
One thing that I have noticed with a lot of the pay transparency things is on job postings now. Another way, it almost feels like employers are trying to get around it, is they will list a reasonable range, but then they will say this range is only for applicants in, and they'll list off a few states. Or they'll say this is based on your specific geographical location. And they kind of go into this whole big thing about basically, unless you are one of these people, this range doesn't apply to you, which I think is also a very interesting way to go around it. It's like, if you're doing all of that effort to go around it, why not just say this is the pay range? Like, I don't, that part is so strange to me.
And I think it's difficult, especially if you use a third party like ZipRecruiter or Indeed, that unless, I don't know what the technical abilities are, if you could maybe limit the posting to certain regions, but I think a lot of it with the internet, it's kind of like
Right. It's
it could be
findable.
in a jurisdiction in which maybe you don't operate and you're not subject to it. So I think employers are doing that just to cover their bases for their requirements. But and maybe they for states where they still have leverage in keeping the salary range anonymous until you come in for an interview or you make contact with the HR department and start the initial kind of recruiting process. I think that's probably another reason to doing it. But it is interesting when you see it's limited to geography, because each state will have there's similar requirements, but not all states have a pay transparency law. But you also don't know if you use a third party where it's going to be posted. Whereas before, you have it, you post in the newspaper, which would be largely geographically limited to where maybe your headquarters are, or you have an internal posting. Obviously, that's a set geography, or you post on job boards in your community or through headhunters in your community. So now, in effect, it could be a national posting, and you want to make sure that you comply with each state's requirements.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Megan, for all those compliance updates. Really solid stuff. And also some other very interesting stuff.
Yeah, I like the articles you picked. It was some thought provokers. I liked it. Yeah.
Pretty good. Hopefully those are helpful to our HR folks in the audience. And this is Checkwriters signing off from Payroll Week 2024.
I have a pickleball game to play.
Oh, really?
Excellent.
I do too.
All right. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Checkwriters. Be sure to follow us on Apple, YouTube, or wherever you view your favorite podcasts. Stay tuned for future episodes where we'll continue to uncover the secrets behind successful organizations.